December 14th, 2025. 6:47 local time. Kupiansk sector, eastern Ukraine. A Russian artillery battery receives a fire mission. 6 Krasnopol precision-guided shells. Target: a Ukrainian trench system that has resisted 3 infantry assaults in 9 days. The battery commander confirms coordinates. His gunners load the rounds. Each Krasnopol shell weighs 50 kilograms and costs roughly $40,000. Each one carries a semi-active laser seeker head, backed by GLONASS satellite corrections for terminal guidance. Standard procedure, standard munitions, standard fire mission. Every single shell will miss its target. But they won't miss by landing in empty fields. They won't overshoot into farmland. They won't fall short into no man's land. 6 Russian precision-guided artillery shells will land directly on Russian forward trenches, on their own infantry. And no one in the Russian chain of command will understand why for nearly 20 minutes. I'm your host at Navy Battlefront, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most extraordinary electronic warfare incidents of the entire Russia-Ukraine conflict. An incident that was never officially acknowledged. An incident that briefly shut down GPS-guided munitions across an entire sector of the front. An incident that proved a handful of Ukrainian engineers with modified transmitters could turn Russia's own artillery into a weapon against itself. This is the story of how electronic ghosts rewrote the battlefield. To understand what happened on December 14th, you need to understand what had been happening in the Kupiansk sector for weeks before. Since late October 2025, Russian forces had been pushing hard along the Oskil River line. The objective was straightforward. Kupiansk sits at a critical rail junction. Control Kupiansk, and you control the logistics corridor feeding Ukrainian positions across a 60-kilometer front. Russian command had allocated elements of the 6th Combined Arms Army to the effort, reinforced by mobilized infantry battalions and artillery groups pulled from quieter sectors to the south. The push followed a familiar pattern: massive artillery preparation, infantry probes, armored thrusts along predictable axes. Ukrainian defenders had been holding, but at cost. The trench system designated in Ukrainian operational maps as Position Vovk 7 sat on elevated ground, overlooking a shallow river crossing that Russian forces needed to secure. Vovk 7 had been attacked 3 times between December 3rd and December 11th. Each assault was repelled. Each time, Russian infantry took casualties crossing 400 meters of open terrain under direct fire. By December 12th, Russian commanders changed approach. If infantry couldn't take Vovk 7, precision artillery would soften it until infantry could walk in. But something else had been happening in the Kupiansk sector. Something Russian signals intelligence should have detected, but didn't. Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists had been operating in the area since November, not the standard jamming units that both sides deployed routinely. This was something different. A specialized team, operating under the designation of the 3rd EW Detachment, attached to the broader electronic warfare architecture of the Ukrainian armed forces, but functionally semi-independent. Their equipment wasn't standard military issue. It was a hybrid system. Part military-grade signal processing hardware, part components developed by a Ukrainian defense technology startup based in Dnipro. The system had a simple purpose and an extraordinarily complex execution. It broadcast falsified GPS signals. GPS spoofing isn't new. The concept has existed since the 1990s. Military planners have war-gamed it. Academic papers have described it. Iran famously used a rudimentary version to capture a US RQ-170 Sentinel drone in 2011. But deploying GPS spoofing on an active artillery battlefield against precision-guided munitions in flight, in real time, that had never been done successfully in combat. Until December 2025. The technical challenge is immense. A Krasnopol shell in its terminal guidance phase is traveling at several hundred meters per second. Its onboard electronics are processing satellite signals, comparing them against stored coordinates, making micro-adjustments to guide fins. To spoof that shell, you don't just need to broadcast a fake signal. You need to broadcast a fake signal that is stronger than the real satellite signal, consistent enough that the shell's processor doesn't flag it as interference, and offset by precisely the right amount to redirect the shell to a specific location. The Ukrainian system, sources familiar with its development described it as the Mara platform, named after a figure from Slavic folklore associated with illusions and nightmares, operated on a principle called signal dominance. It didn't try to jam all satellite navigation. Jamming is crude. Jamming creates noise. The enemy knows they're being jammed and can switch to alternative guidance methods. Spoofing is elegant. Spoofing whispers a lie so convincing that the target believes it's the truth. The Mara platform used an array of directional antennas positioned across a 3-kilometer front. Each antenna broadcast GLONASS format signals, Russia's equivalent of GPS, that mimicked legitimate satellite transmissions but carried falsified positional data. The offset was carefully calculated, not too large, which would trigger error-checking algorithms in the munitions guidance processor, not too small, which would cause the shells to land close enough to the intended target that the spoofing would be tactically irrelevant. The chosen offset, 1.3 kilometers east. Why east? Because 1.3 kilometers east of position Vovk 7 was a Russian forward trench line occupied by elements of the 138th Mechanized Brigade. The Ukrainian EW team didn't choose that offset randomly. They chose it because they knew exactly where the Russian trenches were. Now here's the first question you should be asking. How did the Ukrainians know the fire mission was coming? The answer reveals something important about the layered nature of modern electronic warfare. The Mara spoofing system didn't operate in isolation. It was integrated into a broader signals intelligence network. Ukrainian SIGINT operators had been monitoring Russian artillery coordination frequencies for months. The protocols Russian batteries used were well understood. A fire mission follows a predictable communications sequence. The forward observer identifies the target. He transmits coordinates to the battery fire direction center. The FDC calculates firing solutions. The battery commander confirms the mission. Orders go to individual gun crews. Each step involves radio communication. Each communication is a signal. Each signal can be intercepted. On the morning of December 14th, Ukrainian SIGINT operators intercepted the initial coordination between a Russian forward observer position, call sign Granite 4, and the artillery battery designated as Battery Ural 7. The intercept came at 6:22. The observer reported the coordinates of position Vovk 7 and requested a precision fire mission using Krasnopol rounds. 25 minutes. That's how much warning the Ukrainian EW team had. It was enough. At 6:31, the commander of the 3rd EW detachment, identified in Ukrainian after-action reports only by his call sign, Phantom, ordered the Mara system brought to full operational status. The directional antenna array was already positioned and calibrated. The team had been preparing for exactly this scenario for 5 days. Power systems came online. Signal generators began broadcasting. But there was a problem. The Mara platform had been tested extensively in controlled conditions. It had been tested against static GPS receivers. It had been tested against drone navigation systems. It had even been tested against a captured Russian Krasnopol guidance module that Ukrainian technical intelligence had recovered from an unexploded round. It had never been tested against a live fire mission with shells in flight. The engineering team from the Dnipro startup, 2 of whom were physically present at the EW position, had calculated a 73% probability of successful spoofing based on their modeling. That meant a 27% chance of failure. And failure didn't just mean the shells hitting their intended Ukrainian target. Failure could mean the shells scattering unpredictably across the battlefield, potentially hitting the EW position itself. Phantom made the call. Activate the system. At 6:38, the Mara platform was broadcasting at full power. Falsified GLONASS signals flooded the electromagnetic spectrum across a 6-kilometer radius. To any GPS-dependent system within that radius, the world had just shifted 1.3 kilometers to the west. Every device that relied on satellite positioning was now receiving coordinates that placed it more than a kilometer from its actual location, including the guidance systems of any Krasnopol shells that would enter the zone. At 6:47, Battery Ural 7 fired. 6 Krasnopol rounds launched in a staggered salvo. Standard artillery procedure. Shells fired at 15-second intervals to avoid mutual interference between guidance systems. The shells arced upward on ballistic trajectories, reaching apogee at approximately 4 kilometers altitude, then beginning their terminal descent toward what their guidance systems believed was position Vovk 7. The first shell entered the Mara system's effective broadcast zone at approximately 6:48. Its GLONASS receiver, designed to refine the shell's trajectory during the final seconds of flight, picked up satellite signals. Strong signals, clear signals, signals that told the guidance processor exactly where the shell was relative to its programmed target. Except the signals were lying. The shell's guidance fins adjusted, micro-corrections that shifted the trajectory east. The guidance processor registered normal operation. No error flags. No anomalous signal warnings. Everything appeared nominal. The first Krasnopol shell impacted at 6:48 and 14 seconds. It did not hit position Vovk 7. It hit a communication trench connecting 2 Russian fighting positions, 1.27 kilometers east of the intended target. The trench was occupied by a squad from the 138th Mechanized Brigade's 2nd Battalion. 15 seconds later, the second shell hit, then the third, then the 4th, 5th, and 6th. The shells impacted across a roughly 200-meter spread, slight variations in each shell's trajectory, and the exact moment it entered the spoofing zone created minor differences in the offset. But all 6 rounds landed within or immediately adjacent to the Russian forward trench system. The effect was devastating. Not because 6 artillery shells are an unusual amount of fire on a frontline position. Both sides endured far heavier bombardments daily. The devastation was psychological. Russian soldiers in the forward trenches were being hit by their own precision-guided munitions. The intercepted communications that followed paint a picture of cascading confusion. At 6:49, a frantic transmission from the Russian forward position. Call sign Berkut 2, a platoon leader in the impacted trench section. His voice was captured by Ukrainian SIGINT and later reviewed by intelligence analysts. The transmission was broken, panicked. He reported incoming artillery fire on their position. He believed they were under Ukrainian attack. At 6:50, Granite 4, the forward observer who had called in the original fire mission, transmitted to Battery Ural 7 that rounds appeared to be impacting short of the target. He requested a check on firing data. Battery Ural 7 responded at 0651. Their firing data was correct. Coordinates matched the fire mission order. Propellant charges were standard for the range. Krasnopol guidance had shown nominal pre-launch diagnostics. At 0653, Berkut 2 transmitted again. This time, he was specific. He reported that the shell fragments recovered from the impact site were Russian manufactured. He identified Krasnopol components. He stated explicitly, in a transmission that Ukrainian intelligence would later describe as one of the most significant intercepts of the month. Their own artillery had just fired on them. The Russian chain of command did not immediately accept this assessment. This is where human factors enter the equation, a phenomenon well documented in military history. When information contradicts expectations, the first instinct is to reject the information rather than revise the expectation. Battery Ural 7's Fire Direction Center ran their calculations again. Everything checked out. The coordinates they had been given matched the coordinates they had fired on. Their instruments showed no malfunction. From their perspective, they had executed a textbook fire mission. Granite 4, the forward observer, was caught between two realities. He had watched the shells arc overhead. He had seen them impact in the wrong location, but he also trusted the battery's firing data. At 6:56, a second fire mission was proposed. Battery Ural 7 suggested re-engaging the target with corrected coordinates, assuming their original data contained an error. This is the moment that could have doubled the disaster. If a second salvo had been fired through the same spoofed electromagnetic environment, 6 more Krasnopol rounds would have impacted on Russian positions. The offset was consistent. The Mera system was still broadcasting. The result would have been identical. But Berkut 2's platoon sergeant, a name that appears nowhere in any official record, did something that may have prevented a second fratricide incident. He got on the radio, not on the encrypted command frequency, on the unencrypted platoon net, which was faster. He described the shell fragments in detail. He gave the lot numbers stamped on the Krasnopol casings. He stated flatly that they had been hit by Battery Ural 7 and demanded an immediate ceasefire. Lot numbers are difficult to argue with. At 6:59, the battalion commander for the 2nd Battalion, 138th Mechanized Brigade, ordered all artillery in the sector to cease fire pending investigation. The ceasefire order was acknowledged by Battery Ural 7 at 7:01. From first impact to ceasefire, 13 minutes. But the confusion continued for longer. Between 7:01 and 7:18, intercepted communications reveal a cascading series of accusations, counter-accusations, and demands for explanation traveling up the Russian chain of command. The battery insisted its data was correct. The forward observers insisted the shells had hit Russian positions. The battalion commander demanded an investigation. The brigade-level artillery coordinator, hearing reports of a possible fratricide incident, ordered a blanket suspension of all precision-guided munitions fire in the sector until the cause could be determined. That suspension would last far longer than anyone initially expected. Now, while Russian commanders were screaming at each other on encrypted channels trying to understand what had happened, Ukrainian forces were moving. This was not accidental. This was the second phase of the operation. The GPS spoofing attack was never just about causing a fratricide incident. It was about creating a window of confusion and paralysis in Russian artillery operations that Ukrainian ground forces could exploit. At 7:04, 3 minutes after the Russian ceasefire order, Ukrainian infantry began repositioning along the Vovik 7 trench system. Reinforcements that had been staged 500 meters to the rear moved forward. Additional anti-tank teams occupied positions covering the river crossing. Combat engineers began laying new mine barriers along the most likely avenues of Russian infantry approach. All of this happened without Russian artillery interference, because Russian artillery in the sector had been ordered to stop firing. Comment Phantom if you think the Ukrainian EW team changed the equation in this sector. The window lasted approximately 90 minutes. By 8:30, Russian artillery had resumed firing, but only with unguided munitions. The suspension on GPS-guided Krasnopol rounds remained in effect. Russian commanders, still not understanding the cause of the fratricide, were unwilling to risk a repeat. For Ukrainian forces defending position Vovk 7, those 90 minutes were transformative. The reinforcements and additional defensive preparations completed during that window would prove decisive when Russia launched its 4th Infantry Assault on December 16th. That assault, conducted without precision artillery preparation because Krasnopol rounds were still suspended in the sector, was repulsed with significant Russian casualties. But the story doesn't end with one successful spoofing operation. What happened next reveals how electronic warfare escalates and how one side's innovation forces the other to adapt, creating a cycle that reshapes the entire battlefield. Russian signals intelligence began investigating the fratricide incident within hours. By the evening of December 14th, a technical intelligence team from the Russian EW Directorate had arrived at the battery position. They examined the Krasnopol fire control data. They reviewed the shell's pre-programmed coordinates. They analyzed the forward observer's reports. Their initial assessment: equipment malfunction. A faulty guidance module in one or more of the shells had caused them to deviate from their programmed trajectory. This assessment was wrong, but it was understandable. GPS spoofing was not something Russian field commanders had been trained to expect in the context of artillery operations. They had been briefed on GPS jamming. Both sides used it extensively. But jamming is obvious. You know when your signals are being jammed because your GPS receiver reports an error or loss of signal. Spoofing leaves no such trace. The receiver reports a valid fix. The guidance system operates normally. Everything looks correct, except the outcome. It took the Russian technical team 3 days to consider the spoofing hypothesis. On December 17th, a second Krasnopol fire mission was authorized in a different subsector of the Kupiansk front. This time, the shells were fired at a target area where no friendly forces were positioned nearby. The Russian EW team deployed monitoring equipment to track the shell's guidance signals during flight. The results were alarming. The monitoring equipment detected anomalous GLONASS format signals in the target area. Signals that did not originate from any known satellite. Signals that were broadcasting positional data, offset from true coordinates. The Ukrainian MARA system was still operating. The Russian technical intelligence report, details of which were obtained through Ukrainian intelligence channels, reached a stark conclusion. An adversary electronic warfare system was broadcasting falsified satellite navigation signals capable of redirecting precision-guided munitions. The effective radius of the system was estimated at 5 to 8 kilometers. The positional offset was assessed at approximately 1.0 to 1.5 kilometers. The system operated intermittently, making it difficult to locate through direction finding. That last detail was critical. The MARA platform was designed to be mobile. It operated from modified civilian vehicles, a deliberate choice by its developers to avoid the signatures associated with military electronic warfare platforms. It broadcast in short windows, activated only when intelligence indicated an imminent fire mission. When silent, it was virtually invisible to Russian signals intelligence. The Russian response was a sector-wide order prohibiting the use of GPS-guided munitions in the Kupiansk operational area until the electronic warfare threat could be neutralized. This order, intercepted by Ukrainian SIGINT on December 18th, was one of the most significant intelligence captures of the winter campaign. It confirmed that the spoofing operation had achieved its strategic objective, denying Russia the use of precision-guided artillery across an entire sector of the front. The implications were substantial. Krasnopol rounds were one of the few precision munitions available to Russian artillery in quantity. Without them, Russian gunners reverted to conventional, unguided shells. Conventional shells require more rounds to achieve the same effect on a point target. More rounds mean more logistics. More logistics mean more supply convoys. More supply convoys mean more targets for Ukrainian drones and HIMARS. The cascading effect of removing one capability, precision guidance, rippled through the entire Russian operational posture in the sector. Subscribe if you want to see how electronic warfare is reshaping modern conflict in ways no one predicted. But there's something else that needs to be addressed. Something the Ukrainian after-action reports noted with unusual candor. The MARA system wasn't perfect. During the December 14th operation, the GPS spoofing affected more than just Russian Krasnopol shells. The falsified signals broadcast by the system were indiscriminate within their effective radius. Any GPS-dependent device within 6 kilometers received corrupted positioning data. That included Ukrainian systems. 2 Ukrainian reconnaissance drones operating in the area experienced navigation anomalies during the spoofing window. One drone, a commercial quadcopter modified for battlefield observation, deviated from its programmed flight path and was lost. The second drone's operator, recognizing the GPS anomaly, switched to manual control and recovered the aircraft, but the intelligence collection mission was aborted. Ukrainian ground units in the area had been briefed to rely on non-GPS navigation methods during the operation: compasses, terrain association, pre-plotted reference points. But the briefing hadn't reached every unit in the sector. An infantry squad from a territorial defense battalion, moving to a resupply point, became disoriented when their handheld GPS device began reporting incorrect positions. They were delayed 40 minutes, arriving at the wrong grid reference before realizing the error and correcting course. These are the friction costs of electronic warfare. When you corrupt the electromagnetic spectrum, you corrupt it for everyone. The Ukrainian EW team knew this going in. Their operational planning included risk mitigation measures. But in the chaos of a real battlefield, mitigation is imperfect. There is a deeper technical question embedded in this incident that defense analysts across NATO were asking within weeks. If a relatively small Ukrainian team with commercially derived technology could spoof Russian precision-guided munitions, what did that mean for every military in the world that relied on GPS or GLONASS for weapons guidance? The answer is uncomfortable. Most precision-guided munitions used by NATO forces, Excalibur shells, JDAM bombs, Tomahawk cruise missiles in their terminal phase, rely on GPS for at least part of their guidance solution. These systems have anti-spoofing protections. Military GPS receivers use encrypted signals on the M-code frequency that are significantly harder to spoof than civilian GPS or Russian GLONASS. Harder, not impossible. The Krasnopol's vulnerability was partly a function of its age. The guidance system was designed in the 1980s, updated incrementally since. Its GLONASS receiver lacked modern anti-spoofing features. It was, in electronic warfare terms, a soft target. But defense analysts noted that the sophistication of the MARA system's signal generation was remarkable. It produced signals clean enough to fool the Krasnopol's guidance processor without triggering error flags. If the same engineering approach were applied to spoofing military-grade GPS receivers, the anti-spoofing protections might not hold. A classified assessment circulated among NATO electronic warfare commands in January 2026 reportedly concluded that the Ukrainian spoofing operation in Kupiansk demonstrated a proof of concept that could be adapted against more sophisticated guidance systems within 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years. That's the timeline defense planners are now working against. The Russians adapted. They always do. The question was how quickly and how effectively. By late December 2025, Russian forces in the Kupiansk sector began implementing countermeasures. The first was crude, but immediate. Fire missions reverted entirely to laser-guided terminal homing without GLONASS assistance. A forward observer would designate the target with a laser rangefinder, and the Krasnopol shell would follow the reflected laser energy to impact. This eliminated the GPS spoofing vulnerability entirely, but it introduced a different vulnerability. The forward observer had to maintain line of sight to the target throughout the shell's terminal flight. In a war where both sides hunted exposed personnel with drones and counter-sniper teams, keeping a forward observer stationary and visible for the duration of a fire mission was dangerous. Russian observer casualties in the Kupiansk sector increased measurably in the last 2 weeks of December. The second countermeasure was more sophisticated. Russian EW units deployed their own spectrum monitoring equipment to detect and geolocate the Ukrainian spoofing transmitters. If they could find the MARA system, they could destroy it with artillery or drone strikes. This initiated an electronic cat-and-mouse game that continued through January 2026. The Ukrainian EW team, aware that their transmissions could be detected, employed several countermeasures of their own. They limited broadcast windows to the shortest possible duration. They repositioned after every activation. They used decoy transmitters, simple devices that broadcast GPS-like signals from positions distant from the actual Mara platform, creating false targets for Russian direction-finding equipment. On January 3, 2026, Russian artillery struck a position they believed housed the Ukrainian spoofing system. They hit a decoy. The actual Mara platform was 4 kilometers away. On January 9th, a Russian Lancet loitering munition targeted a vehicle the Russians had identified as a potential EW platform through pattern-of-life analysis. The vehicle was a civilian van that had been parked near the EW team's previous operating position, but had no connection to the spoofing operation. It belonged to a farmer. On January 14th, Russian forces got closer. A Zala reconnaissance drone detected unusual antenna configurations on a vehicle moving along a tree line near the front. The vehicle matched the profile Russian EW analysts had built for the Mara platform. An artillery strike was ordered. The vehicle was hit, but the Mara system had been dismounted and was operating from a concealed position 200 meters away. The vehicle that was struck contained communications relay equipment. Important, but not the primary spoofing system. The Ukrainian EW team lost equipment in that strike. 2 antenna modules were damaged by shrapnel. A signals processor was destroyed. 1 team member sustained minor injuries from fragments. The team was operational again within 72 hours, using replacement components shipped from the Dnipro production facility. This cycle of innovation and adaptation is the real story, not the single fratricide incident, as dramatic as it was. The story is the speed at which both sides evolved their electronic warfare capabilities in response to each other. A spoofing system developed in months by Ukrainian engineers. Russian countermeasures deployed in weeks. Ukrainian countermeasures implemented in days, each cycle compressing the timeline of adaptation. By February 2026, the electronic warfare environment in the Kupiansk sector was among the most complex on the entire front. Both sides operated multiple EW systems simultaneously. GPS signals were unreliable for both armies within a broad zone. Precision-guided munitions on both sides experienced elevated failure rates. The era of trusting satellite navigation on the battlefield was ending, not through a policy decision or a doctrinal change, but through the practical demonstration that a small team with the right technology could make satellite signals lie. There are consequences that extend beyond the Kupiansk sector, beyond Ukraine. The first consequence is doctrinal. Every military that relies on GPS-guided weapons is now revisiting its assumptions about precision strike in a contested electromagnetic environment. The United States Army began accelerated testing of anti-spoofing firmware updates for the M982 Excalibur guided shell in February 2026, directly citing operational reporting from Ukraine. The second consequence is industrial. Defense technology companies worldwide saw the Kupiansk incident as validation of a market opportunity. At least 4 NATO country defense firms began developing counter-spoofing systems for precision munitions in the first quarter of 2026. 3 firms began developing offensive spoofing systems similar in concept to the Ukrainian Mara platform. The third consequence is strategic. If precision-guided munitions can be reliably spoofed, the calculus of precision strike changes. A military that has invested billions in GPS-guided weapons may find those weapons degraded or neutralized by adversaries spending millions on spoofing systems. The cost asymmetry is enormous. A Mara-type system costs a fraction of a single precision-guided munition, but it can neutralize an entire sector's worth of precision fires. This is the economic logic that drives electronic warfare proliferation. And it is why the Kupiansk incident, a single spoofing operation by a small team on a frozen Ukrainian front line, has implications far beyond one battle. There's one more element to this story. One open question that no declassified source has answered. The Russian order prohibiting GPS-guided munitions in the Kupiansk sector was intercepted on December 18, 2025. Ukrainian intelligence confirmed it remained in effect through at least mid-January 2026. But the order referenced something else: a broader review of electronic warfare vulnerabilities across the entire Russian military's precision strike architecture. The review was ordered by the Russian General Staff. Its scope included not only artillery munitions, but also cruise missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, and air-delivered precision-guided bombs, any system that used GLONASS for guidance. The results of that review have not been intercepted. Its conclusions remain unknown. But the fact that it was ordered suggests the Russian military recognized the Kupiansk incident as more than a local problem. It was a systemic vulnerability. And systemic vulnerabilities, once exposed, don't stay local for long. Position Vovk 7 held. Through December, through January, through the grinding attritional warfare of the Kupiansk winter. The reinforcements moved in during the 90-minute spoofing window contributed to a defensive posture that Russian forces could not break. The fourth assault on December 16th failed. The fifth, on January 2nd, was turned back with heavy Russian losses. By February, Russian command shifted its axis of advance 3 kilometers south, tacitly acknowledging that the direct approach to Vovk 7 had failed. A trench line held because signals lied. An artillery battery fired on its own men because the electromagnetic spectrum had been turned into a weapon. A platoon sergeant's insistence on reading lot numbers off shell fragments prevented a second fratricide. A startup in Dnipro built a system that denied Russia precision fires across an entire sector for weeks. And somewhere in the frozen mud of the Kupiansk front, a small team of electronic warfare specialists proved that in modern war, the most dangerous weapon isn't the one with the biggest warhead. It's the one that makes your enemy's weapons work against them. The battlefield trusts nothing it cannot verify. After December 14th, 2025, in the Kupiansk sector, verification became the most valuable commodity in the Russian order of battle. And the Ukrainians had stolen it